Hi there, and welcome to another edition of Israel Explained. And of course, today we're going to be talking about Biden's speech, where Biden took an Israeli offer made on May 29th that was secret and made it incredibly public, leading to all sorts of dramatic responses and effects. So let's first talk about what Biden said. He said that he was going to have a dramatic speech to make about the war and about ending the war. He didn't tell the Israelis what he was going to do. They thought it was going to be more of a general speech. And instead, he brought a secret proposal made on May 29th. And here are the details. He said, quote, Israel has offered a comprehensive new proposal, a roadmap to an enduring ceasefire with the release of all hostages. He divided it into three phases, the first of which would last for 6 weeks. What would happen in that first phase? There'd be a complete ceasefire, a withdrawal of all Israeli forces from the populated areas, but not from all of Gaza. They would remain in strategic parts of the Strip, the release of many hostages, not all, including women and children, Palestinians returning to their homes in Gaza, including the north. That was a major concession that Israel hadn't been willing to make it before. Humanitarian aid will surge and there won't be limits on it. All that and more would begin immediately. During phase one, Israel and Hamas would negotiate over phase two. So phase two hadn't been decided yet. And that would include a permanent end to the war. The ceasefire would continue for longer than 6 weeks, the first phase, I mean, if negotiations were to continue. In phase two, there would be an exchange of all the hostages that hadn't been released in phase one, including the male ones. And as long as Hamas fills their end of the agreement, it would lead to a cessation of hostilities permanently. This, at least according to Biden, is a quote from the Israeli proposal. Now, in stage three, which of course was left vague because even stage two hasn't been fully negotiated, there'd be a major reconstruction plan for Gaza. All the remains of the hostages would be returned. Biden said that Israel can accept this deal and it will be secure since Hamas cannot repeat October 7th anymore. Of course, it's not clear how he knows this, why he's saying that. It's certain that Hamas couldn't do another October 7th now. For how much longer? That's a very good question. Biden said that many in Israel would oppose this deal, but Netanyahu should move forward anyway. And this is an important clue as to why he made this statement now. He's concerned about rising opposition in Israel to a hostage deal that would end the war, and he wants to sort of bind Israel to its previous offer. So he told the people of Israel, quote, think what happens if this moment is lost. The vision of total victory will only bog Israel down in Gaza and further its isolation in the world. That will not bring more security to Israel and will not bring the hostages home, end quote. He also pledged, and this is something that Israel has been asking for, that Israel could resume military operations if Hamas violated the deal, and the U.S. would make sure that Israel had the arms that it needed if that happened. As expected, Biden also linked this deal to Saudi normalization and a potential alliance against Iran. He said also that Hamas must take the deal, end quote. And he told protesters that they should demand that Hamas accept the proposal if they actually want a ceasefire, which is about time. They also worried about Hamas accepting the ceasefire. He said, quote, too many people have been killed. It's time for this war to end and for the day after to begin, end quote. And that's more or less where he left it. So what he's doing here is he's taking an existing Israeli offer, spinning it in a way that fits his own purposes, and making a general call to end the war and reach peace, while also leveraging Saudi normalization for that reason. There are political, domestic reasons for this, with an election coming up in the United States, and the war in Gaza definitely dividing the Democratic Party and causing a lot of problems. But there are also strategic reasons for this. The Israeli war, according to the American judgment, and I agree with this as well, is not going well. Israel's not achieving its plans. It's going into further isolation, something that he mentioned in his speech as well. And by doing so, is also harming the anti-Iranian coalition that Biden is trying to create, moving Saudi Arabia from the pro-American camp, possibly, to the pro-Iranian and pro-Russian camp. Also, the war is damaging relations between Egypt and Israel, which undermines American hegemony in the region, which is based on the peace agreement between the two. Many critics of Biden are outraged by this offer, saying that he's forcing Israel into surrender. But of course, the trouble with that is this is actually Netanyahu's offer. Now, if you watched my previous video, you know under what circumstances this offer was made. Netanyahu was very hesitant to make that offer, but he was outnumbered and outvoted by everyone in the coalition in the wartime cabinet, including his closest ally, Ron Dermer, who switched sides. So everyone, we're talking about Derry, we're talking about Dermer, we're talking about Gantz, we're talking about Gallant, um, they all supported this deal. And Netanyahu was the main holdout, and he eventually agreed as well. So Netanyahu was pressured into this, but he did agree to it. Of course, since he was blindsided and embarrassed by the offer that he had made, Netanyahu was very unhappy with Biden for revealing the offer, but he didn't deny it. He did push back a little bit by saying that it was incomplete. He said, quote, the exact formula we suggested would allow the destruction of Hamas and freeing the hostages, but he did not deny making an offer. So what he said was, the government of Israel is united in its desire to return our hostages as soon as possible and is working towards achieving this goal. Therefore, the Prime Minister authorized the negotiating team to present an outline to achieve this goal, while insisting that the war will not end until all its goals are achieved, including the return of all our refugees and the elimination of the military and government capabilities of Hamas. And by the way, more recently, the government has made it clear that removing Hamas as the government is no longer considered one of the war aims, probably because it's unachievable. So the offer is genuine, but Netanyahu is uncomfortable with the fact that it was presented at all and the manner in which it was presented as a way of ending the war. But more than anything else, it's politically embarrassing for him. And in particular, it's red meat for Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. Um, and they are going to react very badly to this. By the way, they knew about this offer, but most likely they had been assured by Netanyahu that it will not actually happen. A lot of people suspect that Netanyahu was sabotaging this offer behind the scenes. And in particular, now that Gantz is leaving the coalition, this offer will soon be possibly irrelevant. According to a report in Israel Hayom, Netanyahu is going to bring Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, Avi Dichter, and Amichai Shikli into the coalition. And while Dichter is fine, the other three would definitely move it to the extreme, especially Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. And they would never agree to this kind of deal. And that's why Biden released this right now, made it public right now, to sort of try to lock in Israel to this position, which is good for his interests, instead of drifting to a position that is bad for his interests, and in his judgment, and I agree, also bad for Israel. A lot of people on the right are very agitated by this offer, and that's because they've been lied to. They've been told by Netanyahu and his supporters that this war is going very well, and ignored all the distressing signs that it's going badly. But the people in the Israeli government and the Israeli military are very aware that the IDF is not accomplishing its goals and doesn't have a clear plan to accomplish them. And therefore, they're willing to come to an agreement as long as it saves the hostages. So there's a lot of reasons that Biden did this. As we said, there's politics domestically, there's international interests. It also allows Biden to pressure Israel without appearing to abandon it. So he's taking Israel's own offer and using it in a way that's good for his interest. And it's hard to say that he's pressuring Israel when he's using Israel's own plan. But also, it does put the pressure and onus on Hamas. Biden is saying Israel's accepted this. Hamas needs to accept it now. And that makes Israel seem like the more reasonable side. Something that if Israel would adopt as its public relations play would actually be very good for it. But instead, Israel is going to deny that it did it. And that way, it's going to vindicate Hamas. Now, of course, the question you might ask is, what are the chances of this being accepted? The chances are pretty low. So we're talking about an actual offer that was delivered by Israel to Hamas on May 29th. On May 30th, Hamas already announced that they're not going to talk as long as Israel is attacking in Rafah. And as I said here in the previous video, I don't think Hamas is accepting any deal. They see that Israel is hurting itself, and they aren't going to stop Israel while it's hurting itself. They're going to see how long this process of Israel destroying its reputation on the global stage is going to continue and how much damage it can do to itself. So none of this is actually going to work. But if it can lock Israel into a more moderate position, and if it can put the onus on Hamas, it's an operation worth doing. It's a deal worth revealing to show that Israel is actually a lot more reasonable and willing to come to accommodation than the world thinks it is. But considering that Hamas thinks that it's winning the war, I don't think it'll come near to actually ending the conflict. Israel is going to have to cause more pain and more damage to Hamas than it currently is before a deal can be reached. Okay, so well, the last video was very popular and I had a lot of questions. If I missed some, I apologize. I also got a couple questions on Twitter about this. Cartwright, close friend of the show, close Twitter friend of mine, asked if Hamas is left in place, doesn't that throw Abbas under the bus after he did all the things the U.S. asked him to? The answer to that is yes. Once again, the Palestinian Authority is getting the shaft in this plan, and that happened also with the Trump plan. That's happening now. That happened when Israel was sending money to Hamas through Qatar for all these years. There has been an Israeli policy of bypassing the PA, of even moving towards dismantling the PA. And the U.S. is having trouble supporting the Palestinian Authority because Israel won't do it. Israel won't talk to the PA. Israel won't use the PA. So, in terms of a realistic plan, the U.S. doesn't have one for the PA because Israel isn't willing to go along. So the end result of that is that Abbas gets the shaft again. It's not because of an American plan to do so, but that is definitely the end result. JB316 asks, if the war with Hamas ends as humiliatingly as many of us fear, what will Netanyahu do to try to distract the masses from his failure? That's a scary question. He does not want the war in Gaza to end at all, so it would be very hard to force him to end it. But he has other options to distract, among them war in Lebanon, an operation against Syria, and a continuation of his war against the Israeli judicial system and continuing to try to divide the Israeli public and find different scapegoats, blame the United States for all of his failures. He's quite good at that, and his position in the polls is recovering as he's pursuing a lot of those avenues. Felicity asks, why is Netanyahu calling the bombing of tents full of Gazan civilians a tragic mistake, while the IDF is saying it was an accident due to the pinpointing of Hamas leaders outside the humanitarian zone, Hamas storing munition among the tents which caught fire? Are you able to clarify? Yeah, I was surprised that Netanyahu said that, honestly. There's he did that before the full circumstances of it had been clear, although we already had some idea of what had happened. I think he was trying to say that it's tragic that people died rather than taking responsibility in the sense that it was the IDF's fault. So I think he was saying it was because of the IDF's operation that they died without taking the blame for it in the sense that they did something that they shouldn't have. But I think he phrased it in a way that wasn't very good and ended up being sort of a mea culpa that surprised a lot of people. So I think that's what happened. But I think it's good that Israeli leaders say that it's tragic when Palestinians die, especially when you see pictures as heartbreaking as the ones that we saw. So I was pretty happy with that, but I think he might have done that by mistake. Mike asks, should Israel attempt a decapitation strike on Sinwar if getting the hostages out is possibly not going to happen? Does the IDF know where he is? And are they recommending a complete withdrawal? So as for Sinwar, Israel wants to kill Sinwar. The reason they haven't, at least recently, is because he's been surrounding himself with hostages, including some hostages that are have a higher profile in the media, and therefore killing them would very much backfire on the Israeli government. And that's one of the reasons they're not doing it. They also have had trouble locating him. I'm not sure they know exactly where he is, though they think that he's in Han Yunis. But if Israel could kill Sinwar, they would. Are they recommending a complete withdrawal? The IDF right now is recommending that Israel do what it needs to get the hostages back and then try to renew the war later, even if that involves a complete withdrawal from Gaza. But that's not what they want. What they would like is to continue to divide Gaza into two sections, to continue to run the Philadelphia corridor, and have a security area 1 kilometer long from the border. That's what they'd like. But are they willing to withdraw for a hostage deal? Yes. Jose Roche asks, what are your thoughts on the idea of securing the Rafah border and evacuating Rafah? Isn't this what you wanted all along? Yes, I think this is a very good thing. I think that it helps Israeli security. It helps stop arms from coming into Gaza. It gives Israel leverage over Hamas in the negotiations. I think it's very good that Israel did it. I think Israel should have done this a long time ago. It doesn't mean as much as it could mean if Israel had sort of a wider strategic plan to take over all of Gaza and defeat Hamas. But even on its own, it's a worthwhile thing to do. And I'll say more than that, Israel shouldn't withdraw from the Philadelphia crossing. I think going out of there in 2005 was a terrible mistake, and Israel should not do it again, especially considering that it looks like Hamas is going to stay in power. Israel can't allow it to rearm. But it's not a game changer on its own. It needs to be part of a wider plan. Pratchett Guyman, friend of the show, asks, is it likely that investigations into soldier misconduct and this recent conflagration will result in actual punishments of the guilty or incompetent? I feel like the general opinion, at least amongst Israeli critics of the IDF conducting investigations into the conduct of soldiers, is that at best they'll get a slap on the wrist, and more likely they'll just be cleared outright. So this is a complicated question. Traditionally, the IDF does have a fairly good record as far as militaries go of punishing soldiers who have done things that are um, clearly wrong and illegal, although not in all cases. Um, so when they do investigations, they tend to be pretty fair and they have good judges. But very often they won't start investigations because you don't want to investigate your own soldiers, you don't want to lower morale. That's especially true in this war. This is a war that Israelis feel is particularly justified. The soldiers are treated as heroes in Israel. Hamas is treated as an existential enemy, which it is. So it's very unpopular to put soldiers on trial. And even in peacetime, like we saw in the case of Elior Azaria, who killed a disarmed terrorist who was on the floor, which was a clear violation of humanitarian law. He was defended vigorously by a lot of people. Now in wartime, that would happen more. So there's a lot of fear politically of the backlash, especially from the extreme right, but also from regular people in the center of what would happen there. So the IDF is in a really difficult position. It knows that it's actually good for it operationally if it does judge these soldiers and hold them accountable, but because of political reasons, they may actually not. So overall, I'm skeptical that they'll do anything, but maybe not as skeptical as you are. Aliyah says, if civilians were evacuated in Rafah, who were these civilians in the nearby tents? Yes, children are innocent, yet I'm curious about the identity of these civilians. So yeah, there was a lot of misinformation about who was killed in that Rafah attack. Because they were in tents, they were refugees from probably from elsewhere in Gaza, but they weren't in what was currently the protected refugee area. So what they were people who evacuated to Rafah earlier, to an area that was safe earlier. And then when Israel said that that area was no longer safe and that they should move a couple of kilometers north and west to the Al Mawasi, they didn't go. So we're talking about civilians who didn't follow the Israeli orders to the letter, but they're still innocent civilians, and therefore their death is incredibly tragic, and I wish it could have been avoided. Okay, so that's the end of our episode today. If you like what I do here, consider supporting me on Patreon at Shael Media. Tomorrow, I will try to complete my podcast episode about the court of King David. So something to look forward to there. And I will see you very soon on this channel.